Today, we're fortunate to have Mark Vitosh, District Forester, and Dave Wehde, Vegetation Specialist and Conservation Board member, to speak to us about maintaining the health of our prairies and wooded areas. They're going to talk to us also about invasive species, invasive plants in our wooded areas, and about establishing and maintaining prairies in our backyard or wherever, and making them continue to look nice. I think some people think they just scatter seeds and that everything's going to take care of itself when they want to start a prairie, and Dave is going to talk to us and let us know just exactly how that's done. Before we start, I do want to remind you that we have some books on this subject that are on our table here in room A of the library, and these books are available for you to take home today if you check them out. So if you're interested in taking one of the books that is on the table over by the windows, feel free to do so, but be sure and go through the library and check it out then before you take it home. Well, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce David Wehde, who will begin today.
Iowa at one time was in the center of a large, vast system called the tallgrass prairie. Today, most of that has been eliminated due to agricultural operations. The cornfields that we see today were really formerly prairie. Fortunately, we do have a few relics left. I have a few at several of our parks that we have in Johnson County. Solon Prairie. We have some really neat relics at F.W. Kent Park. Some neat state preserves like Williams Prairie. These are the key areas that we started to bring back the prairie from, because we could go out there and actually collect seeds off those sites and start to replant prairie. A replanted prairie and a native prairie, in most cases, are quite a bit different. The native prairies are always going to be somewhat richer, and those are really some of our last natural treasures in Iowa. How do we get started on establishing, let's say, a backyard prairie or even a larger prairie that you may have on your property? Usually, think of it as starting from, just like this screen, a blank picture, almost like a blank portrait or a blank painting. And that's really what you start with. We have to come in and we have to usually remove the existing vegetation. And that might be bluegrass, it might be some noxious weeds, the existing ground cover. We can do that in two ways, usually chemically with a herbicide like glyphosate, or by tilling. And usually I like to come back in and do that maybe twice, because what happens, once you cause a disturbance, that makes it green up with some of those competitive plants that we want to remove from that site, like sweet clover or wild parsnip. We want to get those guys out of there so we can come in and do our seeding. Two types of seeding generally. A summer seeding, and that can start anywhere from May into late June. We come in, we till up that site just shallowly. We don't have to go very deep. Spread our seed mixture on that, and I like to go 50% grasses, sedges, rushes, and then 50% forbs by weight. Now that can vary quite a bit, and there's a lot of different seed mixtures that will work. And it also depends on how much money that you want to spend on the project. So we spread our seed out there. On small sites, some sand in a bucket works very, very well. Just spread that across the site. Lightly rake in or drag harrow, and then come in with a roller or a cultipacker to roll down that surface. Prairie likes firm seed beds, very firm seed beds. So when you walk across that, and you can leave just a very shallow footprint, that's about perfect. That's about perfect. Then, that first year, and sometimes 2 years, you want to keep that site mowed down. Native prairie has extensive and very deep root systems. And the first couple of years, the prairie plants are building those roots down. Our annual non-native weeds like to grow very fast. It's just the opposite. So the prairie plants are going to be very small. The weeds are going to get high. The problem is the weeds can shade out those native plants underneath. So we want to keep a mowing on that, keep that mowed down the first year. After about 3 years, it starts to establish very, very well. Now, long-term management options. In the park and out in our conservation areas, we like to use prescribed burning. And that's usually done in the spring or in the fall. Spring burns usually benefit grasses, and the later you move that spring burn back, let's say a May burn would really benefit grasses, a March burn is going to benefit forbs. A late February burn or a winter burn would really benefit forbs. A fall burn in general benefits forbs. Now, what other options do you have in your backyard? Because certainly you're not going to be able, most people are not going to be able to go out and do burning in your backyard. We'll just simply go out, mow the site down, and rake off that debris. And you can compost that. You may want to take it over to your friend's house and use that as a straw for another seeding, because prairie straw on top of a seeding works very, very well. That's a technique that I was actually just doing this week on a wetland project that we're doing. Other options. What I like to do in my backyard is just to come in and plant into a mulched bed. And that it's just like any other planting into a bed. You can go in, put your prairie plants in, and then mulch around them and use them for weed control. It doesn't look quite as wild as the grass or the regular seedings, but it really does the trick, and it controls weeds very well. Over a period of time when the plants really start to establish, especially if you're using some of these bigger plants, you can hardly even tell the difference. And you can really control it that way. Again, just cut off that dead plant material at the end of the season and dispose of it, or leave it out there during the winter, because I think you'll be very impressed about the amount of wildlife, especially our native songbirds that like to use the prairie, not only in the summer when it's blooming, but in the winter when the seeds are so valuable for their survival. Prairie does a lot of wonderful things. It really keeps our water clean, it builds soil, provides wonderful wildlife habitat, and it's also a wonderful place to enjoy the summer flowers and grasses. Right now, it's starting to get a wonderful fall color. That happens every year. So to get to that point, to get it to look like that, we just need to follow some simple steps. I brought in some handouts from the NRCS that are over on the table. And this probably gives you the basic kind of strategy to follow. If you have individual problems, feel free to contact me out at Johnson County Conservation Board, or Mark, or many of the other people that we have in the community. Iowa City's blessed with many people that are not only interested in prairies, but extremely knowledgeable. With that, I'd just like to run through some of the more common and fairly easy to establish prairie grasses and forbs. The first one on our list is Canada wild rye. And this is a cool season, meaning a cool season prairie grass. And not all, prairie grasses are really divided into two different forms. Warm season, like Indian grass here, that begin growing later in the summer when it gets really hot, like in July. And some of the cool season grasses, much like the bluegrass that we have in our yard, that start in the spring and then green back up in the fall. Canada wild rye, that squirrel tail-like appearance. Songbirds really enjoy it. A fairly common grass that we see in a lot of our conservation reserve plantings or wildlife plantings that can be somewhat aggressive. You want to be careful with this one. Planted in a small percentage or just specimen plants is switchgrass. And switchgrass comes in a lot of different varieties. It's been hybridized somewhat. The Iowa switchgrass is somewhat lower to the ground. And this is Iowa switch, native Iowa ecotype switch, meaning that this is the type that evolved in Iowa. Some of the Nebraska varieties are much taller. And of course, they're using switchgrass as one of the biofuels. They're actually baling it and burning it for fuel in our power plants. One of my very favorites, and endemic to the drier prairie, is Indian grass. The wonderful feathery heads, reddish cast to it now, starting to turn with the fall. Very easy to collect. The seed just rolls right off the stem. Indian grass. Indian grass was very common in Johnson County. Likes clay soils. Wonderful native grass.
Like clay soil?
Clay soil, drier soil. Little blue stem. Little blue stem I'd highly recommend in a backyard prairie. Much shorter to the ground. Not very aggressive to its surrounding flowering friends. Nice companion grasses with little blue stem that I do not have today are Sidotes grama and prairie dropseed. A true bunch grass. Indian grass, in time, will form sod, just like in our yard, a sod-forming grass. Little blue stem is a true bunch grass, just a clump here and there. And the flowers like to live in between those clumps. Not quite as aggressive. Neat feathery head, red wine-colored stems in the fall. Little blue stem. Its companion plant on the richer soils will grow in semi-wet conditions, but likes that well-drained, really what we would call top quality soil. Some of our best farm ground today was converted from places where big blue stem used to grow. Big blue stem. And of course, another name for big blue stem is turkey foot, the three-pronged seed head, turkey foot. Big blue stem. Some of the unique flowering plants are rattlesnake master, yucca-type leaves, kind of spiny on the edges, white flower, spiny tops, easy to establish from seed. Rattlesnake master. A plant, a semi-woody plant, or a woody plant nearly, of the dry prairies is lead plant. And the Indians used to call this buffalo bellow, because actually when this plant flowers, a purple flower, very striking, when this plant flowered, that was during the time of when the buffalo were actually rutting. Buffalo bellow or lead plant. Leadish or lead-colored type leaves. The settlers believed where this plant was found, there were deposits of lead, from which it gets its name. Lead plant. Several types of coneflower occur in Iowa, pale purple coneflower, 3 types actually. One, easy to establish, purple coneflower, more of a southern Iowa plant and actually somewhat rare in Iowa prairies. We see it a lot today in our gardens and it's widely used. Easy to establish, wonderful, almost all summer long bloom. I caught one that was just about at the very end. Purple coneflower. One that was really the true endemic coneflower to Johnson County is pale purple coneflower. Not quite as showy, possibly, as purple coneflower. Likes the dry hill prairies, deep clay soils. Forms a tremendously deep taproot. Somewhat harder to establish in a seeding or planting. But it does establish well from seed. You have to have more patience pale purple coneflower. In western Iowa, we could find narrow-leafed coneflower that occurs in the Lust Hills. So 3 different types of purple coneflower in Iowa. Blazing stars. I think one of the most striking plants in the prairie, this happens to be prairie blazing star, and possibly if you visited Solon Prairie this year, we had a wonderful bloom after this year's prescribed burn of prairie blazing star. Many different types of blazing star. Rough blazing star likes to grow in dry areas. Prairie blazing star will occur in dry areas, but likes that richer soil where maybe you would find big blue stem. Prairie blazing star. There's several varieties, I just named a few. Easy to establish from seed, gray-headed coneflower. Very easy to establish. You can get gray-headed coneflower in 2 years easily from seed. The seed heads have a lemony smell to it. Very striking. Gray-headed coneflower. One of our native clovers, round-headed bush clover. One of our native clovers. White flower, persistent seed head into the winter. The finches really like to get at those seeds in the winter. Several types of gentian occur in Iowa. This is called cream gentian. White flower, seed capsules inside, and the seed actually just pours out. Fairly easy to establish from seed. If we were at Solon Prairie today, we would be looking at a blue gentian called bottled gentian. A little bit more difficult to establish from seed. Coreopsis. Several types of coreopsis in Iowa. This is called tall coreopsis. Yellow flower some weeks past. Seed is just ready to collect now. Tall coreopsis. There's also prairie coreopsis and lance leaf coreopsis. Lance leaf coreopsis blooms very early. Wild indigo, or white wild indigo. There's several types of indigo in Iowa. Deep tap-rooted species, establishes well from seed. The root was actually used for a true indigo substitute for dyes. And the Indian children and settler children used to use it as a rattle. Prairie rattle. Lots of different types of asters. I just grabbed one today that's extremely showy. New England aster with the beautiful blue flowers. And you can see it blooming along the roadsides and out in the prairies right now. Many types of goldenrod in Iowa. Of course, the one that we're most familiar with is Canada goldenrod. Yellow flower, just about done now, fuzzy seed head. Canada goldenrod. A more showy version that we find on the dry prairies is stiff goldenrod, flathead, with the flathead. A lot of people tend to confuse these species for the ragweed problem. When we get ragweed, problems with ragweed. Actually, this is ragweed. This causes hay fever, ragweed, and this happens just to be common ragweed. This does not. So it's ragweed is the hay fever culprit. Many types of mints, and mints in general usually have square stems. That's an easy way to identify them. This happens to be bergamot, purplish lavender flower. Comes in a lot of different varieties now, a lot of different cultivars. Bee balm. Some are actually been genetically mutated to have red flowers. The true one has a purple flower, very common in Johnson County and our prairies. A plant that we see now and is really conspicuous out in the prairie is sweet everlasting. Several types of everlasting. It's been used for years as a cut flower. And it has that everlasting bloom as it dries. Kind of a unique prairie plant is Illinois' bundle flower, with those strange bundle-like seed heads. White, round flower some weeks back. Feathered leaf, almost a sensitive type leaf. Illinois' bundle flower. Of course, Culver's root. Culver's root can be somewhat difficult to establish from seed. You may want to use live plants and inject them into your prairie planting. Tiny seeds inside the capsule, wonderful white flower in midsummer, dissected leaf, Culver's root. Brown-eyed Susan, much like a black-eyed Susan bush. Brown-eyed Susan, kind of a woodland edge savanna prairie species. It can tolerate shade a little bit better. I really like brown-eyed Susan. It blooms later in the fall and the summer after the black-eyed Susans are done. And I just happened to find this one that was still blooming. Black-eyed Susan, brown-eyed Susan. Lots of different sunflowers in Iowa. This happens to be a fairly aggressive one called sawtooth sunflower. But there's prairie sunflower. Those are those real tall ones that you see in our roadsides and prairies right now. Sawtooth sunflower, very easy to establish from seed. I'd use it with a little care. It can be a little aggressive. Some of those really big prairie plants, and this happens to be prairie dock with those giant leaves, almost like an elephant's ear, makes a pretty nice fan on a hot summer day. Prairie dock with that tall, really tall stem. A Cyphlodeum. We're going to go through a couple Cyphlodeums here, a relative of compass plant. Prairie dock. This species, there's some debate if it was native to Johnson County. May or may not have been. Probably not. More eastern prairies, but it is native to Iowa in some rare locations. Prairie dock. It's fairly common in Illinois. More of the eastern prairie species. This is one that I actually picked out of my own backyard. I've had it there for several years. It's really enjoyable. The birds really like to perch on the seed heads in the winter. Some of those, another Cyphlodeum, and a relative of prairie dock, is compass plant, named for its unusual east-west leaf orientation, resinous sap on the stem during the summer. The Indian and settlers, the children, used to peel that sap off and use it as a chewing gum substitute. And if you notice, on some of these, on many of the prairie plants, the leaves are rough and coarse. Well, if you live in a place that's hot, windy, and dry all the time, you're going to have to evolve to make mechanisms so you don't dry out there. And that's what a lot of the prairie species have done. The tallgrass prairie began about 8,000 years ago, and it was destroyed in less than 50 or 60 years in Iowa. By 1860, it was virtually eliminated from the Midwest. Another Cyphlodeum is cup plant. And this one's kind of wilted down, but it forms a cup, the leaves do. And after a rain or a heavy dew, water will form in that cup. Square stem. Likes wetter areas, will tolerate medium soils, and sometimes even you see smaller ones on dry sites, but likes the wet prairie. Cup plant. Sometimes in the summer you'll see tree frogs laying in that water in there and basking. Another Cyphlodeum is rosinweed. Resinous stem, resinous substance on the stem. yellow flower, rosinweed. An annual that we use a lot for erosion control is partridge pea. Yellow flowers, bean-type seed pod. Many of our songbirds and game species feed on those seeds in the winter. Partridge pea. Prairie sage, used by the American Indians for religious purposes. Wonderful aromatic smell to it. Prairie sage, dry prairie species. Now if we go into the wet prairie department, how about cordgrass? This is one that you'll probably have to establish from live plants, and it's very easily transplanted. Cordgrass. Doesn't like to establish from seed very well. Prairie cordgrass. Gets its name because the settlers used to wind this grass up and use it as a fuel source, from which its name comes from. Cord, or cord of wood. Cordgrass. How about seed box? And of course, it gets its name because it forms a box-like structure where the seed is kept. Yellow flower, wetland species, grows in wetter areas, easy to establish from seed. False aster. And you can tell false asters from the real asters because they form seed capsules instead of the fluffy seed heads like New England aster. Waxy-like leaves, a plant of the wetland. Does well in wet areas. I use all these plants in wetland restorations. For a wet site, river bulrush does a wonderful job of stabilizing the soil, a wonderful habitat plant, filtering our groundwater. River bulrush. Its companion plant would be dark green bulrush. And then, of course, soft rush. And the settlers used to, this has a hollow stem, and the settlers used to dip that stem into wax and make it into candles. Soft rush. Soft feeling plant. Blue flag iris, I didn't bring any of that in, but I did bring a few leaves of sweet flag. And if you get a chance today and crush the stem of this leaf, it has a wonderful sweet smell to it. Sweet flag. Well, that's just a few. I thank you very much for having me today. I'm here to answer questions. Mark is going to be continuing with the program after a short break. Thank you.
I'm going to talk mostly about backyard forests, but before I do that, I just want to show you, I'm a tree guy, but I have a prairie in my backyard. And so if I can do it, I think anyone can do it. And what I did in my case is I just had bluegrass, and I went out on 2 different fall days over a 2-year period, and I just used a shovel and started scraping the sod off. And I have areas that are, 10 by 20, then one area is about probably 8 by 30 or 40. Took all that sod out, and then I raked my area and just got it real rough. Then I took seed I had in bags that I had been keeping cool in the refrigerator, and I just started spreading things in the fall. And then I did some more raking. My packer was my spare tire of my truck. I took my spare tire and just ran that back and forth, just packing that seed. As Dave said, you just need to make general contact. You're not trying to bury that seed. And I think I did okay. This is mine this spring, early summer. A lot of coneflower. This actually, this is on its 3rd year here, and I've got rattlesnake master, Sidot's grandma, big blue stem, Indian grass, bergamot. I was writing on my hand in the back. I can think of 15 or 16 plants I've got in there. I'm working on some more. This is this year's seeding, And since I didn't have a lot of weed competition, I didn't mow mine just to see what happened. And this is without mowing, but in a bigger area, I've worked with a lot in bigger areas, mowing is pretty critical to keep the weeds out. I just did some hand pulling as things came up, and things, this is my pocket prairie right here. This is my little pocket. And this is a trail going to there. And as he said, with the wildlife and stuff, it's really neat to see what happens out there. And, time of the year, different times, all kinds of different things. I even got some blazing star right here. This was earlier midsummer, and this was this morning. So depending on the time of year, it's got its own beauties, and I think it's really neat. I was laying on my back as I took this picture, and I'm sure the neighbors thought I was nuts, but I'm going to talk mostly about trees, and that's my big white pine in the back. So the one thing I will tell you about backyard prairies, I think is really critical, is I keep a pretty large green strip between my prairie and my house. Even if you're not burning, if somebody gets wild with fire or something and sets that, if you have that, I really cringe when I see people have prairie right up to the house. We need to think about fire safety too. And one thing you want to do is make sure you have some natural fire breaks within that system. If you ever hear me do a tree talk, I'm not a big fan of grass, but in this case I would be because it acts as a natural, that green acts as a natural fire break. So it's important to think about those things, especially if you're designing things around your house. But my topic is going to be backyard forest today, and sometimes you'll actually find trees this big in backyard forest, especially in the Iowa City area and some of the ravines and different areas. And I want to talk a little bit about what's there, a little bit about some of the things that you might find, some of the things that you don't want. And at the very end, we're going to talk about control of some of those things, and I'm going to ask Dave to come back up because we're going to talk some about garlic mustard at the end, and he's done quite a bit of work on that, so I'm going to have him add some things too. But just to think a little bit about history, at settlement we think we had about 18% of the state covered with forests. That's about 6.5 million acres. We think this was a prairie state, but we know one of the reasons why it was a prairie state is because there was fire. And if you eliminate fire, guess what comes? Forest. So around the streams and the rivers, we had a lot of forest cover. And obviously eastern Iowa was very heavily forested. There was a little forest cover in the west, but in the Luss Hills and that area, we know it was a lot of prairie. But as we come east, we know we had a lot of forest cover. And in the 1960s and 70s, that dropped all the way down to about 2.1 million acres for a lot of different reasons. Just like prairie, agriculture had a big impact, but urban increases in urban coverage, development have had a huge impact on our forest cover too. So many different things have had an impact. Now we're probably somewhere around 7% or 2.6 million acres of forest cover in the state. And in Johnson County, if you look at some of the old surveyor's notes, estimate is around 108,000 acres, somewhere around settlement. And a study in 1992, and I think personally this will be different now, but they thought there was about 11% or 47,000 acres of forest cover. The one thing that's happening in this area though is in a lot of urban areas, it's becoming fragmented. It's being ripped apart. We don't have, I'm a forester, I cover 4 counties, and I would say the average acreage of forest cover I look at is probably about 12 acres. It's not 100 acres, it's not 200 acres, it's people have a little 5-acre patch, a 2-acre patch, a 1-acre patch, a lot of little things. So it's become really fragmented. And also, if we go back in history, they tend to describe our forests as more open. And there's a reason for that, and we'll discuss that, but they talk more about open areas with trees, grass, not necessarily always savanna. You didn't always hear the word savanna, you heard the word open woodlands. So there was kind of a mix there, but maybe it wasn't a true savanna. But you see a lot of information about open woodlands. We know fire was a big tool in the forest areas too. We know the natives use fire for many different reasons, for pushing wildlife, also to promote different plants. They burn at different times of year to promote certain plants, to keep it open. So a lot of the berry-producing plants and other plants that they utilize, or plants that they knew the wildlife utilized, they used fire. Well, we know when we came that we pretty much eliminated fire. And the forest has changed over the last 150 years or more. It really has changed. A lot of our forests, if we have larger trees, we have a pretty closed understory. And a lot of that understory is full of species like sugar maple, basswood, species that are pretty tolerant to shade, but they don't like fire. And that's why they were around, but there wasn't as much in the landscape. And that's one big shift that's happened probably over the last 100 years in the surveys. We went from a lot of oak hickory forest, and we're really starting to shift now to a maple basswood. If you like fall color, that's great. But if you think about some of the wildlife that's developed because of the oak hickory, that shift in maple basswood maybe isn't so great. So one of the things I'll tell you about today is I'm not going to have you go out and kill all your maple basswood, but diversity is important. And in some cases, even in backyard prairies or backyard forests, we've even looked at reintroducing fire or burns in little timbers or even in big timbers to try to bring back some of that open woodland. Not in every situation. You really have to look at it, but we're looking at prescribed burning and forest cover too. And actually, they've done some of it in some of the Johnson County areas over the last couple of years. So we're looking at those different things. But a lot of us think that if we just let things go, then it's okay. But the reason a lot of things are the way they are is because there's always been a human touch. So sometimes, if we want to get back to where they are, we have to bring the human touch back. And also invasive species. I think we're creating a huge cesspool of exotic pests in our forest by saying, let's let nature take care of it. Because if we don't look at it and really don't see what's there and just say, well, it's a wooded area, it must be okay, hiding back in the woods is some vicious plants. And I'll show you some of those today. So, topic is backyard forest. And they can be, very large wooded areas, depending on where you live, what part of the county. Like I said, I've been in some backyard forests that are 10 acres. I've been in some backyard forests that are 100 acres. Or I've been in my own that's not even a quarter acre. It's probably, I don't know, in depth probably 50 to 60 feet, and in length maybe 80 feet. I don't know, it's not much, but it's my forest, okay? And there's no garlic mustard in there yet. It's got it coming from all different directions, and I'm going to start working with my neighbors here a little bit and try to help them a little bit. It had some honeysuckle and different things and barberry when I got there, and I'll talk about some of those plants. They're not there, but I've got elm and maple and cherry, but I also have some dead trees, which is okay. They're wildlife habitat. We'll talk about that. They can have many different benefits, and actually that happened to be an elm, so I had some mushrooms the next spring, which was okay too. So again, there's many different things in many different sizes. I was fortunate that I worked in western Oklahoma right when I got out of college in the late 1980s, and I worked in western Oklahoma, and I was known as the guy that took care of the one tree. So to me, one tree is a forest. So it doesn't necessarily have to be huge. You don't have to have this mass of trees to have a forest. But there's many different benefits. Wildflowers in the spring, ferns, and there's fall flowers, many different things to enjoy in our forest cover. As I said, if you like morels, this spring wasn't as good, but it was good enough. If you found some, it was good enough. But there's many different things out there that we can utilize. Wildlife. That little one on the left, I'm fortunate enough in my job, I carry a camera on my left side all the time because you never know what you might step on. I was 2 feet from that little dude. Then I tried to get to a foot for a real big close-up, and boom, it darted. But it held tight. And then even a tree like this, like I said, it's dead, but look at that, cavities. I mean, there's wildlife that can utilize those. There's many different benefits for a dead tree. Now, with that said, I don't have this in my talk, but a dead tree in the wrong place could be a hazard. So if it's a dead tree next to the house, especially if it has a poor structure at the base or a lot of decay, or even a live tree that has a lot of decay right next to a house or a trail, then that's a different situation. But if it's somewhere, if it falls, it's not going to hurt anything, or there's nothing for it to hit, then it's okay. But in some situations, you may have to reanalyze that tree because it may be a hazard. And even, this is the forester in me that has to speak, we utilize trees all the time. And I've had people in their backyard forest actually utilize, some folks, if they have a tree that's starting to decline or it's a hazard, they'll cut it down, they'll take it to a local sawmill, or they'll have someone come with a portable sawmill, and they'll use it to create mantels in the house or furniture on their own. I've got one guy that's really unique. They have 5 acres, and every piece of furniture that's been made in their house has been made from the oaks from their property. But they're taking oaks as they decline, or as they're trying to create space for new trees, firewood, whatever it may be. We can utilize it for many different purposes, depending on what our goals are. And then, of course, fall color, I think, is very unique. I do show a maple, beautiful fall color, but I'll tell you, my favorite fall color, when it comes, is the purple of the white oaks. I think it's a beautiful fall color. Some years it's not as good as others, but we have some beautiful native trees that have some nice fall color. And then water quality. I have a creek behind my house. You know, as water runs through the system, it cleans the water before it gets to the stream. This is actually a stream. This isn't in a backyard forest, but this water is going right into the Cedar River near Palisades State Park. But all that water is run through a forest area as it comes to there. So that forest is a filter. So is the prairie. That backyard prairie is also a great filter. It's a sponge. You know, with that soil and everything there, they're great sponges to filter that material through the system before it gets to our water sources. Just want to talk about a few species that you might find in your backyard as far as trees. If you have kind of a bottom or a low area that maybe is a little wetter, some of the species that you may find would be like silver maple, green ash, cottonwood. Cottonwood's a great tree in the right place, especially if you're in an area where you have turkeys. It's a great roost tree for turkeys. They love it. Bald eagles, if you're in an area there where you may have some bald eagles. Also, if you like raccoons and the cottonwood has a big hole, they'll like you there too. River birch is another one that you may find. It's a native bottomland species that, you know, when you get that clump birch at the nursery, a lot of times that's river birch that you're buying. Hackberry actually is a bottomland tree that actually can grow on the slopes and up on the hills too, but it's one that will grow in the bottoms. Sycamore. Some people either love sycamore or you hate sycamore. It has a disease that the leaves will kind of fall off in the spring and early summer, but it's a huge, beautiful, massive tree, kind of like cottonwood. And in the wintertime, it has kind of a whitish, brownish, peely bark that's it's very, very nice. And then willow. There's a number of native willows that you may find. And there's some other species too. I didn't put them in here, but there's even, we have native to our bottom areas, swamp white oak and pin oak. Pin oak, we're actually here in Johnson County, we still might run into a little bit of pin oak. We're kind of on the northern edge, but then we have what we call northern pin oak that we might find. So there's some oak species that you might also find in those bottom wet areas. Then on the side slopes tend to be a little cooler, especially if they're on the north or east. Now if they're on the west and south, you're going to find some drier species, but on the north and east, you'll find species like sugar maple, basswood. Another name for basswood is linden, serviceberry, which is actually a smaller understory plant, understory tree, white flowers in the spring. Some people call it Iowa's blueberry. It's got an edible berry on it. It's a very nice kind of edge plant. Black cherry, white ash, red oak. and then bitternut hickory. So there's a number of species that you may find. Sometimes you'll find elm in the bottom and also on the side slopes. Then on the uplands, aren't those beautiful big trees though? Those are native red oaks, just monsters. Those trees there are probably 120, 130 years old. But on the uplands where it tends to be a little drier, you might find species like bur oak, white oak, shagbark hickory, and even black oak. A lot of people on dry sites will say, well, this is a red oak, but a lot of times if it's an area that's kind of dry and sandy, it usually is black oak. They look kind of similar, but it's more common than we think. We actually have it in Iowa City, up in the Manville Heights area. I know there's areas where you can find black oak along with bur oak and white oak. But all these species, at least here, they like sun. So they're not going to come up amongst themselves. So in a lot of our areas where we might have a lot of big bur oaks, a lot of white oak and shagbark hickory, a lot of times we have things like sugar maple and basswood and some of those species coming up through the understory. Now again, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. That means the forest is changing. When we used to have fire, things would get set back. New species, new oak and hickory could come in. Now, as that oak and hickory comes out, it's going to shift to that other forest type. It takes a long time, but it is going through a shift. So, what are some of the things we can do to manage our backyard forest? I think one of the key things is to monitor the health. We have a number of diseases, and I'll discuss one of the key ones that we're starting to see and then we've had for a number of years. And then we can do some things to actually promote growth. We can use some forestry management tools or techniques to actually help even in the backyard. And sometimes that means cutting a few trees to help another one, to give it more room to grow, and we'll discuss that. And then I think one of the big ones, if we do nothing else, I think monitoring and managing exotic invasive species is very key and very important. And I'll finish up with that. So one of the disease and monitoring health, you know, the first thing I always tell folks is walk your area, or at least observe it many times through the year, especially during the summer months. Starting in the spring, just look at things. Look for wilting leaves. Look for leaves that aren't the right size. Look for browning. Look for trees that maybe don't leaf out as soon as they normally do. You know, just look for changes and look for those throughout the growing season to try to look for problems. If you have a tree like on the left that's starting to brown usually around June or July and it's an oak, there's a good chance it could be oak wilt, especially if it's on a red oak or a black oak or a pin oak. Oak wilt is a disease caused by a fungus, and it gets to the tree two different ways. This fungus is very similar to the fungus that causes Dutch elm disease. Kind of works the same way. The way this gets to the tree, if you have a broken branch in the spring, early summer, there's a little beetle that's feeding on a diseased tree somewhere, and it picks up the little spores, and then it goes out, flies around, and it likes sweet things. Well, if you have a broken branch on an oak in spring, early summer, and there's some sap flow, that beetle flies to that open wound, starts feeding on that, but the spores get put on that tree or on that open wound, and that's how the tree initially gets the fungus. And once that tree gets the fungus, it can actually spread that fungus from one tree to the next if they're close enough. Because underground, those trees will actually, the roots will graft. And actually the disease can move from one tree to the next right down the pipe. But they have to be the same species. It has to be red oak to red oak, white oak to white oak, bur oak to bur oak. It can't be red oak to... So if you have a red oak that's dying, right next to it you have a white oak. The white oak shouldn't get it through root grafts, okay? As I said, red oak and black oak and pin oak are probably the most susceptible. But you can get oak wilt on white oak. You can get it on bur oak. If you get it on red oak, that tree will be dead in 1 year. It'll start showing these symptoms, and before the summer's over, generally that red oak will be dead. If a white oak gets it or a bur oak gets it, sometimes they can live for a number of years before the disease finally kills them. We used to say white oaks and bur oaks didn't get it very much, but We don't say that anymore. I know in Iowa City we've had a number of them tested over the last summer, and we've had a couple positive results. I know in Manville Heights we have some white oaks that have oak wilt. Just because a branch is browning, though, doesn't mean you have oak wilt. The time of year and some of those will be critical too to determine. Iowa State has some good information on oak wilt. I have a few pamphlets on it over there. I'll tell you, the best way to prevent oak wilt, though, is not to prune your oak trees from March till the latter part of September. If you don't wound your trees at that time, you're reducing the open wounds, so you're reducing the potential of that disease to be able to spread.
September, did you say?
Yeah, I would say early March till the end of September. I tell folks if you're going to prune oaks, prune them in the winter. That's the best way to prevent oak wilt. Okay? Just a new one, and we don't know if this is a disease or insect problem. We don't think it's either. We think it could be something else. Just real quickly, I get a lot of calls in the last couple of years, actually over the last 10 years, where we're getting oak trees that in the springtime they come out and it looks like the leaves have been chewed. If an entomologist, an insect specialist, looks at those leaves, they say, Mark, there's been no insect chewing those leaves. The edges are smooth in a way they can actually tell if it's an insect or not, and they say they don't think it's an insect. We're pretty sure it's not a disease. We're starting to look at some other things, and actually the Forest Service is actually getting involved with this. We've seen it on little seedlings that come from our state nursery planted out. We've seen it on trees this tall. We've seen it on 200-year-old oaks. I've seen it in people's front yards. I've seen it on campus. Seen it out in the woods, out in the middle of nowhere. I've seen one tree show it. I've seen another white oak within 15 feet not show it. It's a mystery. One of the concerns or one of the potential causes is herbicide drift. And that's a big can of worms, and I don't have 2 days to talk about it today, so I'm not. But it's something I want you to be aware of. I did bring some stuff on oak tatters. I've worked with the Forest Service on one of their publications. It's something to be aware of because there's something going on with our oaks, and we need to pay attention. So, what are some of the things we can do then? Forest stand improvement, basically, in our backyard is any practice that improves the growing conditions and or overall health of the existing stand of trees. And examples of this might be vine cutting, and that's cutting vines if you have a vine that's actually growing up into the crown of a healthy tree and starting to compete with the leaves, just cutting that vine. You don't necessarily have to treat it, but just cutting it and killing it from that point up is helping that tree. Crown competition removal or removal of exotic plant species like they talked about and we'll talk about in more detail. Crown needs space. So as trees get older, actually the thing that helps them is not necessarily fertilizer. The thing that helps them is room to grow and being able to get some sunlight. So sometimes in a forest situation, if you have a quality oak or maybe even a quality maple, say you have an elm or a honey locust or something that's competing with that crown, you can remove those trees and help them. So you can actually eliminate competition. And you might actually cut some trees directly around or kill some trees standing to help an individual tree. Now, once you do that, you're not killing everything around it. You're not making a park, but you're helping that individual crown. So you might kill enough trees so that when you're done, that tree you're helping has 4 to 6 feet of area for its crown to grow. So depending on how many trees are around it, how close, that will, in some cases it might just be taking out one tree to help that tree expand. Now with that said, sometimes there's nothing wrong with 2 trees going real close together and letting them fight it out. There's nothing that says that that's wrong. That is kind of nature's way. But at the same time, if you have a more desirable species, say you're really trying to promote acorns, the more crown you have, the more acorns you're probably going to produce. So if you can help that tree out, you can do some things. So those are little things that you can do to help. Again, more crown space that you can give those trees, better off. And as I said, cutting vines, and I carry a pair of clippers everywhere I go. Even when I'm walking people's place, I can just walk and cut vines as I look at things. Now, I don't cut all vines. Vines have great wildlife habitat, great benefits. Certain species are very beneficial. So again, I only go after those ones that are actually growing up into the crown of a tree or causing some problems. Exotic species, invasive species. This is how we're going to kind of finish up. We'll take another 5 or so minutes here and then we'll be done for a break. And stay on schedule, Melanie. We will. I'll take a few extra minutes. But basically, exotic invasive species are plants not native to the U.S. that have adapted to local growing conditions and that reproduce successfully. And these plants are serious because they can outcompete the stuff that's supposed to be there and really create negative impacts. It's a big concern of mine, and there's a big difference. I mean, we have some native plants that their habitat is that they are invasive. They're pioneers. They get into a place and they kind of take over, but they're native plants. But then we have other plants that aren't, that get introduced and take over, and they're really not supposed to be there. So there is a difference there. One species is a landscape plant that's used quite a bit called barberry. There's many different varieties. There's yellow varieties, there's purple varieties, there's green varieties. They have this little red berry. They have a little thorn on them, little bar thorn, pretty sharp. Some people look and say, well, that can't be too bad. Well, this is a small timber up in Lynn County, and that's a mass of barberry. So, and those are about 4 feet tall. They get very thick. And there's patches of this all over this timber. Actually, you can see some green patches back there. There's some back there. Over time, that's going to take over that entire understory. If that's shading below, that means the wildflowers and everything else is going to have a tough time to grow too. Now, if you don't like multiflora rose, this isn't as bad as multiflora rose, but it's pretty bad. It's pretty nasty stuff. And I've seen some of it can get quite tall. The other thing is, as these plants get bigger, they have a pretty aggressive root system, and they're pretty tough to dig. I was pulling one. It took me about 20 minutes before a shovel and a hatchet and everything else before I finally got it out of the ground. So getting them early. And I'll talk about some of the things you can do. Right now, I just want to show you a few of the plants that we have concerns with. Honeysuckle. The native honeysuckle in Iowa is actually more of a vine. It's not a bush. So if you have a bush and it's a honeysuckle, it's not native. Honeysuckles produce nice red berries that are great for wildlife. The state and all kinds of agencies planted a number of these plants, not barberry, but like honeysuckle for years for wildlife. It was great for wildlife, but wildlife has to go to the restroom. And when they go to the restroom, they plant new plants. And that's part of our problem. These are getting spread mostly by birds. Some plants will spread by roots, but a lot of these will spread from birds. They have a beautiful white flower. So when I come into someone's little timber and tell them that nasty plant that they enjoy so much in the spring really shouldn't be there, they don't always like me. But that's okay. But this is what it can do. It can take over the understory. And actually, I have another picture that's not very good, but I show this because you can see it. This is only about 5 feet, but that plant can get 6 to 8 feet tall. I've been in some where I've literally had to crawl through the timber. There was so much honeysuckle in there. And the nasty thing about this stuff, it's pretty, in some cases, shade tolerant. So it can get in there and kind of really take hold. This might get me in trouble, but this is a tree that I'm concerned about, that I see in Iowa City area and some native areas. This is Norway Maple. It gets planted a lot. There's many varieties of Norway Maple. There's a lot of green varieties, and there's one that's actually a purplish variety. A lot of people call red maple, but it's actually a Norway maple. I've been trying to get my dad to cut his down for years, but he won't. If you live in town and there's no native woodlands next to you, probably not a problem. But if you live on the edge where there are some native woodlands or a creek, the park behind me has some Norway maple, and all along the creek there's little seedlings coming up all over the place of Norway maple. And in the East Coast, in New York and stuff, they've had a really big problem. It's actually outcompeting the native sugar maple. It's not a native plant, so it's taking the space of stuff that's supposed to be there. And this one right here is in about an 80-acre woodland in Johnson County. I was out looking at a harvest And right out in the middle of harvest, I find a Norway maple. I was kind of shocked. I found some at Lake McBride. We've pulled those as we find them. One way to tell Norway maple from the sugar maples is they look a lot alike, but they'll have a milky sap. When you pull the leaf off, right at the end of the petiole, it'll have a little milky sap. It's not as good at this time of year in the fall, but throughout the growing season, it'll have that little milky sap, which is a good ID characteristic. This is a stand of Norway maple right next to Carver Hawkeye Arena in that native savanna wooded area. That's a pure stand of Norway maple. All came from one tree. There's a big, huge tree that they had in there, and they're starting to do some work in that area. So it can get pretty aggressive. This is another one that's not really been planted but spreads a lot. This is Tree of Heaven. It gets rather tall. It looks like sumac, but it has a little wing on it, almost like maple, but it's a twisted little wing, so it's a little different. Very large leaf, but on the petioles it has these little notches, and sumac won't have that, so that's one way to identify it. And it smells too. You grab it, it's got a real kind of stink to it. Sumac will have the little red seed heads. That's one way to tell it apart. But it's pretty aggressive. Tree of Heaven's one name. Tree of Paradise is another. It's very weak wooded, but very aggressive. Put a crack in the cement, Tree of Heaven will grow. It's a pretty aggressive plant. Another kind of shrub, small tree, is common buckthorn. Very aggressive. You can go over into that savanna wooded area, Carver Hawkeye, and the entire understory is common buckthorn. It gets really thick. Tree gets, or shrub, can get 5 to 10 feet tall and pretty much take an understory over. These little purple berries this time of year are a great ID characteristic. It also looks, the leaf looks a little bit like dogwood and has what we call sub-opposite leaves. They're not quite opposite, but then at the end it has this little stipular little thorn right at the end of the shoot or branch, which is a good ID characteristic. This is a new one, and I show you this because this is a vine growing over a tree. It's pretty much taken over. If you've heard of kudzu in the south, this is the new kind of kudzu in the north. This is called Oriental Bittersweet, and it's a bittersweet. We have native bittersweet, but our native bittersweet is not as aggressive as this plant. This plant is so aggressive that it will actually grow over the tree and pretty much suffocate a tree, and it will die. Has a very large vine as it grows, very large. You can actually, I've had some so big that people that turn wood will turn wood with it. I mean, it's a big vine. Very aggressive. Dave and I were talking about the ID characteristics a little bit. It tends to have a little more oval leaf than our native, and then it's just, the native is just not as aggressive as this stuff. And we can get you some more specific information and identification, but especially around the reservoir area, we've seen it. I think Dave mentioned that there's some other places that he's seen it. So it's around, and it's one that can be very aggressive that we need to pay attention to. So there's a number. There's some vines, some shrubs, and some trees. So how do we manage the woody ones? I think the key is monitoring, and if you have an area that doesn't have any of this stuff, that's great. That's the best way to start because you can go in there and kind of keep a clean sweep. I think one of the best things to do is to dig them or pull them when they're small. But sometimes when they're as big as some of these can get, digging and pulling may not work, but you can try. If you can't dig and pull, cutting those stumps and treating with a registered herbicide that's on the label, glyphosate, which is Roundup, and many other chemicals, is one that could be used as a stump treatment. But digging is a good one if you can get them early on a lot of these plants. And when they're small, a nice spring day when it's wet, some of these plants are pretty easy to plop out of the ground. The other one is do not landscape with some of these plants. The state and others are starting to look at some plants and take them off list and stop selling different things to try to reduce the problem. But I can tell you right now that they're not going to take Norway Maple off the list, and probably most landscapers would want to do damage to me for saying this today, but it's a plant that we need to be aware of and be concerned about. Now, garlic mustard. This is save the best for last. This is the, it's a biennial plant, so it takes 2 years for it to go through its cycle. This is a first-year plant. This is a second-year plant producing flowers, and I've had people say, gosh, I have these beautiful flowers about May and June in my backyard. Well, sometimes those aren't the beautiful flowers you want. This plant can get, 2 to 3 feet tall, really good soils, maybe a little taller, very aggressive. I'm going to go back to this picture, but I want to show you this before I have Dave come up. This is how it can be aggressive. This is an entire understory of garlic mustard. If you like to hunt mushrooms, I've been in places where this stuff gets so bad you can't even find the mushrooms. Not good. It's a very aggressive plant. Seed can last 5 to 7 years. Dave's going to mention some of the things that we've tried and people have tried. With that, I'll have Dave come up and kind of finish up there, and then we'll take a break. I'll get back to the slide there for you, Dave.
Just leave that one.
You want that one?
Yeah, I like
you
that
changed your mind, okay.
I like that one better.
I'm going to leave that one. Go ahead.
Garlic mustard. Oh, boy. I can remember the first time I observed garlic mustard, and it took me a little while to figure it out because it was so different to see a white flowering species that time of the year. But what do we do about it? And what do we do about it? And what's the long-term effects? Well, when we're at this stage of the game, and if you're when we're at this stage of the game, and if you're one of our native wildflowers trying to compete in something like this, we're really in trouble. I mean, that's really what invasives do, all invasives. But in this case, garlic mustard.
Try that.
In this case, garlic mustard has spread through the entire forest. All of our young wildflowers are completely shaded out. They're having a hard time competing, or they're generally going to become extirpated or extinct from the site. Also, if you're an oak seedling trying to germinate, and in my mind, oaks are the most important wildlife tree in Iowa, and they're declining because of, 1, our forests are becoming more and more shaded, 2, our forests lack fire, and 3, it's really, we're not working on our forests the way we should. We've allowed our forest in general to become so overgrown with large shade-tolerant species that fire probably won't change it. We have to mechanically go in there, cut those, open the thing back up, and start burning. But if you're an oak seedling underneath this, you're just not going to make it. So what do we do? What have we tried? Well, this is what I've tried. At this stage of the game, right as it starts to flower, I'm actually going to go out there with a weed trimmer and cut that plant off right to the very base of the rosette. It's a biennial. It thinks then that it's done flowering for the year and it's already produced its seed, so it won't resprout. You get about a 90% elimination or a kill on that, you might say, of the species. Now that's a lot of work. I mean, you're out there cutting, and I'm wearing a hard hat and a chainsaw mask, and by the end of the day, I really smell like a garlic salad. I mean, it's all over my face. Another thing that we've tried, garlic mustard's weakness in the winter, the late winter especially, everything else has not started, but it's the only green thing in general in the forest. It shows up just like, you can't miss it. You'll see it out in the forest. It's the only green plant. If you can get out there and just spot apply Roundup on that plant, that will take it out too. Other control measures that we've tried, burning. Well, in general, when we try to go out and do a forestry burn, we try to do those in the fall. With garlic mustard, that's a big mistake. you want to do it in the spring. Burning forests in the spring is usually much more difficult because it's wetter. This year especially will be a good year to do timber burning. If you burn in the fall, you open up a big black area, and if the seed bank, and this has a seed bank that lasts 6 years. In other words, once it seeds, that seed is going to be down in the soil for 6 years. So if you burn in the fall, you open up a big black area, what's that plant going to want to do? It's going to explode. You're going to have a lot more garlic mustard. But if you burn in the spring, right when it's starting to shoot, or about this stage, if you can get it to burn, if you have a lot of oak leaf under there, it will burn, in most cases, if you have the right conditions. It'll wilt it, knocks it back. There's a pretty high mortality on that too, if you got it at the right time, that there's not enough root reserves to make it resprout. If all else fails, you have to go out and manually remove the plant by pulling. Well, I don't know how many days that'd take you folks, but for me, just pulling a patch like this is going to take quite a while. And all those plants, you can't just go out and pull it and drop it on the ground. No, because the seed will actually mature and germinate. So it has to be removed from the site. And then what are you going to do with all of it? You got a pile of it, and that has to be composted or burned or disposed of. Overall, when we manage, and we have to manage invasive species, not one form of management works, but a combination of many forms. So what I'd probably do on a site like this, I'm going to try to do a spring burn on it. That next winter, I'm going to go out there in the late part of the winter, before the native wildflowers start to come up, try to go out there and do some spot application of glyphosate with some dye in it, so you know where you've actually been that day. I'm going to go out a little later, go out there and cut some of that stuff down before it sets seed, and then after it starts to set seed, I'm going to go out there and try to manually remove that plant from the site. And it's tough, and it's a terrible threat. And this is just one of them. Mark mentioned quite a few. If you're out in the prairies, I really fight Canada thistle a lot. Crown vetch is really a invasive plant. And I fight that in our natural prairies, or native prairies, a lot too. So these are the vandals that are breaking in. And a lot of people think, development and all those, and farming, those are kind of threats, and that's always going to be there. But really, this is like biological warfare on our natural areas. So that's about all I have.
With that, we're supposed to take a break, so we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back to questions.
Can you get help for fire burns? It says, who can help with fire burns, both prairie and woods? If a person wants to burn an area, is there anybody they can call to help with that, to do it right?
That's kind of tough right now, and I get a lot of questions on that every year. There are very few private contractors that go out and do prescribed burns. They're trying to make some changes in the insurance laws that will allow that, because it's, if you think about it, if it gets out of hand, and it can, and Mark's been on the fire line with me a couple times, and he knows what it's like. It gets pretty hot out there, and it can get a little scary sometimes too. Real smoky, and all I'll say about prescribed burning is be very careful when you do it, and make sure that all your ducts are in order, that your fire breaks are good, like Mark was talking around your house, something that I failed to mention, and that try to think it out, and don't do it during times when you're inviting disaster, like high windy days, or if it's really, really, really dry out. But right now, no, there is one company in northern, or it's actually southeast Wisconsin. I'm not sure if they're still in business. whoever asked the question, get back to me after the program today.
I'll add to that, Melanie. There is a small group out of Iowa City. I don't know what their insurance status is yet, but you can get with us. There is a company that's been doing some small burns. The thing I'll add is, just as Dave, make sure that you have some training. I know in past, the county has actually had some workshops where they show equipment, and actually they do a night burn, but they do some stuff at the beginning. There's some other courses. I know Indian Creek Nature Center actually every year in the spring and March has kind of a woodland burn workshop. I think it's an all-day, probably only like $10 or $15, but they go through the entire steps. Even with all that, you should probably definitely work with somebody that's done it before you go at it. And one other thing that's happened, the DNR is starting to work with the rural fire departments, because we know that with all the new CRP and stuff coming in, people have prairies and large areas that they want to burn. We're looking at trying to get some wildland or some burning training on prairies or even woodlands with those folks, to maybe even a local rural fire department might be able to help somebody. So the government agencies realize there's a need out there, so we're looking to try to get some more training and some different things out there. But it's slow and coming, but it's coming.
Are there city regulations against burning?
In Iowa City, you have to have a burning permit. You have to go through a process. We've even worked with local schools where you have to have a burn plan that has to get submitted to the fire department, has to get approved. You have to send letters to all the surrounding neighbors. And I don't know what they do is for individuals, but I know you have to go through the Iowa City Fire Department.
In addition to that, the fire department will not allow a burn within 50 feet of a structure or building on the property.
The
So
fi-
that'll be a limiting factor in a lot of cases.
Right.
Yeah.
The fire department will not allow a burn within 50 feet of a structure, is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
That's the
That's
Iowa City Fire Department.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Here's a question. Can you burn prairie grass if you have trees as part of the planting area?
You can, and usually you need to have those trees. Those trees have to be a larger diameter, especially usually it's oak trees with us. Fire will kill oak trees. It will kill woody species in the prairie. That's what it does. But bigger trees, some trees are more tolerant of fire, oak especially. Shagbark hickory is pretty tolerant of fire. Most of the mast-producing trees are tolerant of fire, but a small diameter, it's going to top kill it. That's kind of a judgment call. What I do when I have small diameter stuff that I don't want to burn up when I'm doing a prescribed burn, I go out there and I cut and rake all that dead material back from it, and then try to protect it by watering it down real good, or taking some wet burlap and wrapping it around the stem. But that's kind of it works sometimes it doesn't. So.
But the good thing about oak, which he just said, if it still burns it, most of your oaks will sprout back from the stump. That's why they survived the fires, because they kept coming back. And then after the burns, once they got to a decent size, they were able to resist that fire. So even if all that doesn't work, a lot of times those oaks will still sprout back, even if you get them burned.
If you think about oak, and oak are really fire dependent, most of the oak species, well, what happened? Fire came through, killed out all these shade tolerant guys underneath. They drop their acorns. They have to have full sun to germinate. Well, the shade tolerant guys have been knocked out by the fire. They get to grow then. So it's not really that hard to figure out.
Can I add one more thing, Molly?
Sure. Go
I
ahead.
do that a lot.
No, go ahead.
It's really interesting in the literature. They talk about, in the early 1900s and stuff, they talk about the outburst of oak. There was too many oaks. The oaks were taking over. It's because in a lot of those areas, they had these grub areas that would burn for years and years and years and grub the oak down. They stopped burning. Those oaks were allowed to grow. And so we had these oak forests coming up all over the place. And some of the early literature actually talked about we're being overtaken by oak. So it's again, the perspective has a funny look at it sometimes.
Where can we buy prairie flower seeds?
A lot of different companies. Just get to me or talk to me after the program today. I don't really want to go on too much about that. There's a lot of different companies.
Okay.
The local
large
Natural
variety.
Resource Conservation Service office has a list.
There's a list.
County has lists. We all have lists that we can get to you.
You mentioned mowing down a backyard prairie. What time of year should that be done?
I'd usually do it in the spring. The winter time, it's pretty important to keep that stuff out there for the wildlife, where you're kind of defeating the wildlife purpose by destroying it in the fall. You could do it in the fall, probably the spring, and just rake or remove that debris at that time.
This is a tree question. Our pine forest is turning brown. What can be done to help them? That's the question.
It depends why it's turning brown. Well, maybe at the end we'll talk about. There's a number of things. One thing with pine and spruce, if they're fairly dense, those branches will tend to die out on their own. They'll actually shade out. So a lot of times you'll have the understory or the lower branches pretty much just be no leaves at all. That's pretty common. So the first thing would be to look back and see if it's more of that inner growth that's dying. That's kind of a natural thing with density. But then depending if it's pine, spruce, or fir, we have a number of different disease and insect problems on a number of our different evergreens in Iowa as a whole. We have a pretty significant disease / insect problem on Scotch pine. Pretty much all the Scotch pine, once they reach 15 to 20 years, have been succumbing to one of these disease problems that we have. So again, it depends on how they're dying. If they're dying from the tips and stuff, it could be a disease or an insect problem. So maybe afterwards that person can come up to me and describe it, and we can determine if it's a shade factor or maybe a disease problem.
We have no understory seedlings. Is this most likely due to deer? What do we plant to establish new growth?
Well, one thing is, if we know the deer here, if you have deer, you've probably seen them. So I mean, because they're not too scared. So most of us, if deer are really utilizing a lot of that understory, you can probably usually tell. One reason why you might not have a lot of seedlings, depending on the forest type that's there, might be the amount of shade. If it's got a lot of maple in it, or it's just a dense area, sometimes you won't get a lot of seedlings. If it's really dense, you just won't get a lot. It could also be the soil types, but if you want things like oak, the one thing Dave mentioned is basically you're going to need sunlight. So even if you have a healthy overstory and you have even average moderate shade, if you underplant oak, they're not going to thrive. They may live, they'll struggle, they'll live for a while, but they're not going to thrive. I can go through many forests and I'll find little oak seedlings. I can come back in 4 or 5 years and the majority of those oak seedlings will be gone. Most of the time, I mean, if deer take them, yeah, but if they didn't, most of those would never survive. I'll get a lot of people that'll take seedlings, they think, out of the forest that are oak. They may take a seedling like that. That seedling may be 20 years old or 30 years old because it just struggles, but it doesn't have enough sunlight. So one thing, if you want to reintroduce something like oak, you would need some pretty decent open areas where you're going to get sun through the majority of the day to give those trees a chance.
I think maybe in this situation, she was talking about underneath those pine trees.
Oh,
If that
okay.
were the situation, do you have any thoughts?
That's probably a density or shade issue. And the other thing is that, again, depending on the species, pine needles and stuff tend to be a little more acidic, and so the pH would be different. So some of our hardwood species may not be germinating. And that pine mulch creates quite a mulch, so that may be another reason why there aren't any seedlings coming up there too.
Can I seed in the fall before a hard freeze? What is best, spring or fall seeding?
I've really gone to fall seedings, and in fact, just in a few weeks is a very good time to seed. Tends to benefit forbs. There's not a lot of site preparation. You can actually go out, kill the existing vegetation on the site, or in my case, I'm going to be seeding directly into a bean field that was Roundup ready, so there's no residual herbicide in the soil. and we actually go out and just spread that seed right directly on the soil, and that's it. And we let the snow and the frost work that seed in, and in general, that really benefits the flowers, and it gives the flowers about a year, sometimes 2, of a boost ahead of the grasses. The grasses are there. You don't see them quite as quickly as you do on a spring or a summer seeding, and it gives those flowering species, especially things like Prairie blazing star, some of those more difficult species to establish from seed, a head start. So yeah, you bet.
When you
Fall's
talk
good
about
time.
forbs, what are you talking about?
Flowering plants, flowers. Yeah.
Okay. When is the best time to spray garlic mustard?
When everything else is dormant. And garlic mustard will be the only thing green in the forest. It's going to stand out just like a lantern out there, just green blotches of it in patches. And you can actually go out and hit it then when all the good guys, the good plants, the native plants, are actually sleeping underneath in the soil, and they're not green.
Some
You have to
people spray in the spring or fall.
Yeah,
but
you can.
The key time is when everything else is dormant.
If
So
you
the
ha-
very early spring. or
Very
late
early.
winter.
And actually, if you have areas where there really isn't anything underneath, except for maybe some aggressive native plants or maybe non-native stuff, I'd spray it. Just spray it and get rid of it as a noxious weed, because it really is a threat. Stop it from
Go ahead.
spreading.
The thing they gotta remember though, I hear people that'll do that or they'll pull and then the next year, like he said, it's just like whoosh, there's this huge area of garlic mustard again. It's like, what did I do? Then you gotta remember there's so much seed there that this is not something that's gonna get done in 2 years. This could be a very long, continual battle. I think though once you get an area cleaned up, or if you don't have an area that has very much, once you get to that point, it's going to be much easier to manage. It's really difficult when you have this huge mass. It's going to take a very long time to do it. So we don't want people to think that these are silver bullets, that boom, you're going to come out and you're going to get it done. It's going to still take a long time. But again, if you don't do anything, it's not going to get any better.
I think the most alarming thing about garlic mustard is you'll start to get up one side under control, and then you really have it starting somewhere else, and then it's just so, that snowballing effect, there's just more and more and more. But the devil's really in the dirt with garlic mustard, and it's the seed bank, and you have to fight the seed bank to control invasive plants. A plant like crown vetch that we have escaped into our prairies has a seed bank that lasts almost for a very, very long time. So I could spray it 1 year, burn the area, the fire actually makes it want to germinate, it helps crown vetch, and then I'm trying to expunge the seed bank by doing that. I might burn that area more to try to get it out of the soil. So
If a person needs to spray a large area, so they're not using cans of Roundup, let's say, and they want to add some dye to the Roundup so they can tell where it's, can they do that, and how do they do that?
that's what I do, and it's just a water-soluble dye. I use it all the time.
It's commercial, I mean, it's available for that purpose.
Available commercially. It's called Tracer. There's a lot of different types, so different brand names. You just mix it right in with your solution.
Will oak tatters leave a tree once it has it?
I'm going to answer that, but I want to say something about garlic mustard real quick. One thing I wanted to add was you can move it through your shoes too. So if you have an area that has garlic mustard and you walk through it, you should wash your shoes thoroughly before you go to another area. Before I first learned this and was starting to learn it, I didn't realize we had that much. I'd come home and I'd start finding garlic mustard near my doorstep, or I'd take my boots off every night. So one way it gets into places, it gets in on deer and other things, and it gets tracked. So you can take it with you. So it's important to clean your boots and things like that if you're going from one place to another, because you can track it right to your place. So if you're going to learn about it, make sure you clean thoroughly before you go home, okay? Because you don't want to take it. Now on oak tatters, could you repeat that question?
It says, once you have oak tatters, once a tree has oak tatters, is it destined to always have it,
Okay.
or can it get over it?
Great question. That's I've been tracking this problem on oak tatters since 1992 when I came back to the state, and a couple springs later, 95, 96, I was working in Iowa State and I had calls. I had 36 counties just in eastern Iowa that somebody had oak tatters on their trees. It was just, people thought we had gypsy moth and all kinds of things. So I started watching individual trees, and there's 2 trees on First Avenue that I've been watching since 93. They've had it 1 year and never had it again. I've got other trees that have had it that I'm watching in forest stands that have had it the last 3 years. And in that same forest stand, I had one tree, I had probably 200 trees that had it. I had one tree in the middle of that 200 trees. Same species, right in the same crown, did not have it. Everything else around it had it. So some years they'll have it, some years they'll have it. I've been rating these trees for the last 3 years from 0 to 5, 5 being the worst. Last year I had a lot of 1s and 2s. This year on my stands I had a lot of 3, 4s, and 5s. So this year it seemed to be worse in some of my stands and not as bad as others. So to answer your question, if it gets it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's doomed. That doesn't mean that it's over. If it happens to be herbicide related, we don't think it's immediate drift, because a lot of things will get hit by drift, but there's so many things that have happened in the last 20 years in farming, from the sense of when we spray, what we spray, and some of those things. There's a lot of chemical in the air. We know that. We don't know what some of those low doses, what impacts they may make. And we're not just seeing this on the one species we're seeing it the most on is white oak.
That's right.
I do see it on bur oak some years, but I also see it on hackberry. We have a similar symptom, tatters, on hackberry too. But I don't usually see it on red oak, but for the first year I had red oaks this year in some of my stands that I found tatters on. And like I said, I've got some that they're right next to ag fields. I've got others that are 3 miles away from the closest ag field, and they still have tatters. So there's a lot to learn about what's going on. It could be other things too. So there's a lot of research, but at this point, we're not doomed. Now, with that said, I'll put the caveat that we've had some of these stands up in northern Iowa that have had tatters for a number of years. We're starting to lose some of those trees to other problems, like root rots and some canker diseases, because that's stress. Those trees in the springtime, I walked down in June in these forest areas, there was no shade. They were so tattered, there was no leaves on them, then they had to put new leaves on. So that's a lot of stress for those plants to go through, and if they have to do that year after year, that breaks down their defense mechanisms, and then these other problems can come in. We've got an insect called two-line chestnut borer that can come in. We've got a lot of things that can come in. So the battle's not over yet, but we're going to keep trying to find out what causes it.
What can you do to save an oak tree that has oak wilt? Is there anything?
If it's a red oak, it's over. You can't do anything. If someone tells you they can, they really can't. If red oak shows symptoms and it's starting to wilt, usually that tree will die within 6 to 8 weeks, and that tree will be gone. There is a chemical, though, that some companies sell that's a fungicide that they are injecting. They've had pretty good luck in Minnesota from a preventive standpoint, like even on red oak. If there's an area that trees are getting infected, they've injected healthy trees and they've prevented the spread of the disease to that tree. With that said, it's a very expensive, you might pay $14 to $18 a diameter inch to have that tree treated every 2 to 3 years. From a protective side, you have to treat that tree every couple of years to have that chemical in there to protect it. Now on white oaks and bur oaks, they've had some luck on pruning out the dead material and then using this chemical to stop the disease. But that's kind of so-so. So that I think the best thing is prevention, is not pruning those trees during those critical times, March to late September. It's on a case-by-case basis, though. If it's red oak, pin oak, black oak, if it gets it, you're going to have a problem. On the white oak and bur oak, I think there's still some potential treatments that you might be able to slow it down or expand the life of that tree when they've had some luck. The other thing you don't want to do if you have some trees with oak wilt, don't keep that wood as firewood, because if you have pretty large limbs with tight bark, the tree produces a fungal mat, and the fungal mat can still be produced on those. So if you're going to use firewood or keep it, you've got to actually seal that for a year and tuck it in tight so those beetles can't get in and utilize that. The other thing that they can do for prevention is if you have a tree that's died, they'll actually go in and break root grafts, either using trenching or a vibratory plow. But if you've got utilities and sprinkler systems and all that, that throws a big mess in. So there are some treatments out there, but it's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. How do you tell the difference between poison oak and poison ivy vines and other non-toxic types of vines between the two?
You want to grab that?
You don't have to, because poison oak doesn't occur in Iowa. It's just, no, it's not in Iowa. All we have is poison ivy. Now, recently, I did some training with the Army Corps of Engineers just a few weeks ago, and we had a wonderful botanist there. And they're going to reclassify one of the types of poison ivy in Iowa to actually, it could be a different species, and that's western poison ivy. Now, let's kind of think how we see poison ivy. We see the poison ivy that's climbing up a tree in a vine, and also you see the poison ivy that's just growing away from trees, almost like a shrub. Well, that's different because it lacks those tentacles that the stuff that grows up the trees have. And it's actually a different species probably. But there's no poison oak, hopefully never will be unless we introduce some other invasive species. No poison oak, no poison sumac, just poison ivy.
Now, if you see a vine and you wonder whether it's poison ivy or something that's not poisonous, something that's not toxic.
A lot of people confuse Virginia creeper with poison ivy. That has, 5 leaflets. Poison ivy only has 3.
Okay.
Virginia creeper
5 to
will be
6.
like your hand.
Right.
It'll have the 5, what he's talking about, leaflets. The whole thing is a leaf, and then it'll have 5 leaflets coming off in a span. And that's what right now is turning real reddish, purplish on a lot of trees, is that Virginia creeper.
Is that harmful to a tree?
No, as long as it's not, again, getting up into the, if it's just along the branches, most of those vines are aggressive enough that they're going to girdle a tree. As long as they're not getting up and actually competing with the live material, I would leave them because they're very pretty, and they also produce a small berry that's good for wildlife.
So if you're concerned, what are you most concerned about with a vine that's going to get up into the crown? Is there one particular kind of vine that's aggressive enough that it usually ends up in the crown?
Well, poison ivy can actually get up. I've seen poison ivy vines rather large that will get up, and they'll get leaves that are very large. Virginia creeper usually isn't too bad, but the newest one, the bittersweet that I was showing you, that's one that really seems to be a big concern because it's so aggressive that it just covers everything.
Right.
And if you don't get that off, it will eventually kill the tree.
We have some grapevines that
Right.
will get up into trees that are 20 foot tall and just shroud them.
Yeah, he mentioned, for the TV audience, he mentioned grapevine, that too can be aggressive. I forgot that one.
Yeah.
How can you plant new trees in areas where deer are eating everything?
Well, Dave will throw his opinion, but my opinion is if you don't use some type of fencing, a cage or something, it's just not going to work. You got to keep them out on an individual basis if you're trying new trees. The city has done that along Dubuque Street. They'll put them up every year, and then I think they might take them down at different times of the year so they're more aesthetically pleasing. But they'll put them up, and you pretty much have to create some kind of cage that's tall enough and strong enough so they won't push it over and then it won't reach over. And the thing with it, if you can get it up above the deer browse, you can take that part down, but then you're going to have to put something around the trunk to keep the deer rubbing from being too bad. So, and there's a number of people who will use tubes. I've had some people have had luck with just the snow fence material, wrapping that around and creating a little tube. It kind of rattles, and they've had some luck. I've had other people that said the deer will just rip those off. So I've had some places where it's worked and some not. Some people will use the drain tile type tube. But if they're going to use a drain tile type tube, I would use a white, so it, not the black, because it won't heat up as much on the trunk of the tree. And with those, you would only need them up in the fall, early winter during the rut to prevent that. So, Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
It's essentially what Mark was referring to. You have really two, what do deer really do to our trees? Well, they're eating them and they're rubbing on them. And that's the two things you got to fight against. You want to plant larger stock that gets above that deer browse height as soon as you can. You also want to have some kind of protection around that trunk, especially this time of year where they're going to be out there with their antlers rubbing on it. So that's the two problems with deer.
How to diminish what we think is wild rose, thorns, vines, and invasive in our ravine?
Wild rose.
Multiflora, probably, you think?
Multiflora rose. Multiflora is very difficult to control. What I like to do is go out where I can get there with a large mower, brush cutter, have your armor on, your face mask, your helmet, all that stuff so you're not ripped to pieces, and mow over that stuff and then use an RTU type herbicide to treat the tips. Now fire, the cut surface, fire can really decrease multiflora too, but you have to get it to a point where you have fuel underneath. It causes a lot of shading. It depends what type of habitat you're in. If you're in an oak hickory forest where you have a lot of really good leaf fuel under there, you can really get a good top kill on it. After a couple years, it really, really retards it. But it's tough to control. Again, the devil's in the dirt. You're going to be fighting that seed bank for quite some time.
Shade will help too. If the ravine is starting to get trees, as those trees start to canopy, actually over time they will shade out the multiflora rows. It takes a number of years, but if you get into a healthy timber area, a lot of times if there's not a lot of sunlight, that rose will really go down. And also we have a disease that is starting to knock the multiflora. There's a disease called rose rosette that from a rose grower it's not a good thing, but from the multiflora, it is actually in Johnson County. I walk all over the place and I'm starting to see the disease rose rosette on our roses. So that'll knock the multiflora down a little bit too.
You're going to notice it. It has that. It makes the multiflora look like it's elongated with bright reddish stems, and you're going to think, that really looks different from multiflora. Well, it's dying. That usually occurs where it's more open, where there's more of a savanna or sunny area. Where the rose is actually semi-shade tolerant in the forest, you usually don't have any rose rosette on it whatsoever. So, and kind of, if you think about how we need to manage our forests by keeping them more open, well, that kind of helps multiflora rose, because when you go in and do some selective cutting, more light, you have more rows then. But you want to keep the forest open, because remember, the more densely we keep our forest shaded, what's the other plant that's going to really help if we keep our forest densely shaded? Garlic, mustard. Okay.
Is Crimson King a Norway maple?
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions, and I don't know if you're aware of this area, there's a prairie on the corner of Raritt Road and Mormon Trek.
Yes.
It says, suggestions for the prairie on the corner of Raritt Road and Mormon Trek. It is very ugly right now. Many homeowners are unhappy with it.
I believe that might be a city prairie, or they're working with the association, so I would call the city parks department.
That might be a good
discuss with
idea.
them, because I know they're trying, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I know they're trying to do some stuff with that.
Okay, probably in the process.
Yes.
I just personally, I'd like to know, a savanna is an area that has a lot of sun, is that correct? Or can you have any trees in a savanna?
A savanna, let's think of what a savanna really was, and really in Iowa City was a really large savanna historically. Savannas, when we drive through the country today and we see those huge open grown trees, and it doesn't have to be oak, there were other species that were that way too. Hickory, black walnut, even maybe black maple. So these were these giant open grown trees, underneath, it was very open, but not completely brushless. Small trees trying to reshoot after a fire, maybe some brushy species like sumac, hazelnut, plum, especially in Johnson County, and then an element of prairie grasses and flowers, and then an element of just species that were endemic to savannas, flowers and grasses. So it was kind of the in-between between the forest and the prairie with both elements together, and it was very, very beautiful. Savannas were lost very quickly in Iowa. Why were savannas lost quickly? Well, if you were a settler or a pioneer and you were moving across the state, here's these beautiful shade trees, and that's a pretty nice place to build a house under. So, and that's really what happened. So, but even today, we can see those beautiful oak. And I don't know if you've been to Rochester Cemetery. I'd highly recommend that because that really shows a nice savanna area. And that's, it's fun for guys like me and Mark that we love both, so when you're in a savanna, you're a really happy place. That's a great place. You get to see the trees and the prairie plants too. So.
Well, that's wonderful. I just want to thank you so much for all you've told us today. It's been just a great program. Thank you very much.
Thank you.